Let's give it a whirl. So thank you for coming, everyone. I think most of you have met us at some point in time. My name is Richard Foti. I'm one of the faculty members of the TRP. It is my great pleasure to be the chair today for this capstone defense, which effectively means I'm the host and fairly unimportant other than just introducing everybody and keeping the questions moving. The purpose of the defense is to give students a chance to share and exchange the knowledge they acquired throughout their capstone process. The defense is a public event where students can invite any of their project stakeholders or interested parties, friends, families to take part. It should encompass their journey through the capstone. Okay, so it's not just here's a project, here's what we did, here's what we learned, and that's kind of it. There's a lot of learning that goes into all of that, and a lot of lessons you pick up along the way. So it's a full journey, and we want them to talk about not only what they found out, but what it means and what this means for the future and what they plan on doing with it and all of that. It's supposed to be general enough so that it's understandable to everybody who's here, regardless of whether or not they have any clue what they're talking about. Okay, so the topic shouldn't matter. This is part of the translation. It's part of the learnings they have from the TRP, as we want this to be accessible. Where was I now? Okay. So the defense is actually, so it's a 20-minute presentation, followed by about an hour and 10 minutes of sort of question and answers. And then there's a formal defense committee that is going to assess whether or not they pass or not. And so the questions will begin with the defense committee, and we'll kind of cycle through. So what I'll ask the committee is, you can have as many questions as you want, but we're going to take them one at a time. Okay. So everybody will ask a question, we'll go down the line, and then we'll come back and go again. And we'll just do that as many times as we need to, sort of until we run out of questions. If there's time at the end of that, we'll open up the floor to the rest of the people who are here. If perchance we don't have time for the rest of our community here to ask some questions, when the review panel goes away to deliberate, we'll have 20 minutes to a half an hour with the team where we can ask questions and talk about it. So let me introduce first our team. So Yasmin, Yasminu, sorry, can you wave? Yas, there we go. Steph, yeah, and Kailey. Cool. And then our review committee today is where are we? Our advisory committee is Heather Ross. There you are, and Melanie Jeffrey, and Richard Peter. And then our community member, sorry, those are our community members. Our departmental representative is Dr. Avram Gottlieb, who's also here. Hi, Avram. And the TRP advisor for the group was Dr. Joseph Fehrenbach, who you met a little earlier. So after the presentation, we'll split into a breakout room with that committee, and they'll assess whether or not the team has done enough to have earned the degree. And the three choices are basically pass as is, so everything's hunky-dory, we're great, okay? Or pass with edits, which means things are great, there's a couple of things we want you to add to the report. So a few minor changes have to be made, or you don't pass. It's a fail. So we're hoping to avoid that. And that's it. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the mic over to our team. We're not going to start the presentation right away. There's a couple of slides that they're going to walk us through. So when you're ready, we'll take a pause and go, okay, we're going to start now, and then we'll start sort of the timer on the presentation. Is that all right? Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to mute myself and pass it over to the team.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you for the opportunity to deliver these first couple of slides. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to all of you for attending our capstone presentation today. To begin, we would like to start with a land acknowledgement, followed by introductions. As settlers on this land, we would like to acknowledge that we have the privilege of living and working on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. This land is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Takaranto a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This photo depicts the Humber Bay Arch Bridge, which is located where the mouth of the Humber River meets Lake Ontario. This was an important route of travel and trade for many First Nations, with archaeological evidence of human life extending back 12,000 years. The primary route ran up the valley of the Humber River, across to the Holland River, into Lake Simcoe, and from there by water links to Georgian Bay. My name is Stefan Superina. I'm a second-generation settler of Italian and Austrian ancestry. I completed my Bachelor of Education at Queen's University with a specific interest in outdoor and experiential education and land-based learning. I'm now a cardiology research associate at the Piedmont Cardiac Center, and through the Capstone project, have sought to broaden my understanding of Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies.
Thanks, Stefan. I'm Yas Moayedi. I'm a first-generation settler of Persian, Turkish, Russian, and Mongolian ancestry. As a first-generation immigrant, my family embraced the Indigenous history of this land and had close relationship with elders in our community. I'm a trained cardiologist, and one of my primary career goals is to address inequities of health among underserved communities using digital health.
Thanks, Yas. Hi, everyone. My name is Kailey Setinausen. I'm also a settler on this land. I'm a third-generation Canadian of German and Austrian descent. I live by the Rouge River, which has been a prominent trade route for thousands of years. I completed my Bachelor of Science at McMaster University in biology and psychology, and I'm currently a first-year medical student at McMaster University.
Thanks, Kailey. We're very grateful that Laura Hannock can join us today to create a live graphic recording of the presentation. Laura, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself to the audience today?
Hello, I'm Laura Hannock from Swoop Media. I'm joining you today from Petawawa, Ontario, the land of the Algonquins. Happy to be here today, and you can look at my screen at any point to see the drawings.
Thanks, Laura. It is critically important for our team to acknowledge that we make this presentation during a time of untold tragedy and sorrow for families, survivors, and all Indigenous peoples and communities concerning Indigenous children whose bodies continue to be discovered at former residential school sites across the country. Reaffirming a truth that Indigenous people have long since known and spoken about, but our government and religious authorities have purposely denied the existence of. This is a map depicting former residential school sites in Canada. Schools that were part of a shameful colonial policy run by the Canadian government and religious authorities during the 19th and 20th centuries that forcibly assimilated Indigenous children as part of the Indian Act. More than 150,000 First Nations children were required to attend residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report in 2015 documented the deaths of more than 6,000 children as a result of residential schools. Residential schools were in fact part of a larger colonial policy designed to erase Indigenous language and culture. Sometimes going backward is the best way to move forward, because those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It has become all too apparent that many Canadians know little or nothing about the deep historical roots of the ongoing issues stemming from settler colonialism generally and residential schools specifically. For our team, while doing research for our Capstone project, we came upon a publication by Kathleen Absalon and Susan Dion entitled Doing Indigenous Community University Research Partnerships, A Cautionary Tale, where the authors describe the complexities of doing decolonizing research within colonial academic institutions. The authors use the word research and apply a hyphen to indicate their commitment to the production of knowledge that is both Indigenous and decolonizing. Our team adopted the use of the word research by Absalon Dion to describe our own evolution as non-Indigenous researchers trying to commit to an Indigenous informed process and authentically engage in the relational aspect that is at the core. The time, understanding, and reflection required to engage respectfully in this space, or else risk repeating the mistakes of the past. We use the term rediscovery to inform you of our personal learning journey and critical reflection of our knowledge gaps, implicit biases, and positionality to the research. Today, our team will be presenting on the following 4 overarching themes to describe our journey of research and rediscovery. Neither of us will try to steer the other's vessel. recognizing the power of words, respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility, and remaining neutral is being complicit. The reflexive journey that follows describes an evolution in our understanding framed by the notion that the implementation of digital health technologies will ultimately not improve access to care unless relationship-driven models of research defined by reciprocity and responsibility are at the very core. As described by Dr. Angela Mashford-Pringle and Kira Pavagati in the accompanying quote to this slide, building relationships is the first step in Indigenous research, and it is often the biggest challenge to researchers entrenched in traditional Western models of research and academia. The Truro Wampum, dating back to 1613, is widely recognized as one of the first formalized treaties between Europeans and Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, or North America. Such treaties form the basis of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Ontario is covered by 46 treaties alone. The Truro Wampum Treaty was made between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee and envisions a relationship between the two treaty partners based on peace, friendship, and mutual respect. The parallel rows of purple wampum represent the journeys of two peoples, neither interfering with each other's voyage or trying to steer the other's vessel. Indigenous people view these principles as fundamental to the relationship with settlers. As we reflect upon the meaning of the Truro Wampum, our group's natural tendency in conducting research and engagement at the outset of our capstone may have been to try and steer the other vessel, to direct the process in a manner that suited our needs, and to fulfill our own sense of accomplishment according to what we had set out to do, as is often the case with traditional research methods. Instead, as the process evolved, so did our awareness of allyship, sustained relationship building efforts, the importance of being invited to do research with Indigenous peoples rather than offering to do research, and being an active listener throughout. The ethical space of engagement, as defined by Indigenous scholar Willie Ermine, builds on the underlying principles of the Truro Wampum and is born out of the philosophy that there are two distinct spheres of knowledge and contrasting Indigenous and Western worldviews. As a team, our collective experiences have traditionally been aligned with Western empirical methods grounded in the scientific method of hypothesis building and testing, data collection and analysis, and theory development. This typically is a deficit-based approach, which tends to highlight poor health outcomes in one group as compared to another, and can contribute to stigmatization and stereotyping. In contrast, Indigenous worldviews are characterized by balanced, harmonious, reciprocal relationships that look for ways to highlight or acknowledge strengths, talents, and skills of the community in an attempt to create research that is useful for the peoples and respects Indigenous ways of knowing. The ethical space of engagement is an opportunity to bring together different ways of coming to knowledge and applying this to the practice of research. Typically, Western worldviews are taken as central, and it takes an active acknowledgement and learning of the different worldviews to even try and find the ethical space. In Canada, we have a long and well-defined history of violating the ethical space of engagement in research. Research has often been conducted on Indigenous people primarily for the benefit of non-Indigenous researchers. Researchers often enter communities for short periods of time, collecting and taking data away with no further contact with the community. And in some instances, research data has been taken and then subsequently used without permission. The picture on your left depicts a nurse taking a blood sample from a child at a residential school in Port Alberni, BC in 1948, during a period when nutritional experiments were being conducted on children in residential schools under the purview of the Department of Indian Affairs Canada. In these experiments, parents were not informed, nor were consents obtained. The picture on your right depicts vials of a BCG vaccine developed for tuberculosis. First Nation infants from the Capel Reserves in southern Saskatchewan were used for trials of the vaccine in the 1930s and 1940s. So what happens as a result when we continuously violate the ethical space of engagement and try to steer the other vessel? We end up with a colonial healthcare system that was never created with Indigenous people or views in mind. This cycle, the legacy of colonialism, serves to hold the status quo in place. This cycle is depicted in a November 2020 review into findings into racism, stereotyping, and discrimination against Indigenous peoples in the British Columbia healthcare system. After engaging with over 9,000 healthcare providers, caregivers, patients, and families, a report entitled In Plain Sight was released, painting a staggering picture of widespread systemic racism against Indigenous peoples that perpetuates a vicious cycle of stereotyping, discrimination, reduced access, and poor outcomes. While this report may be specific to British Columbia, the 24 recommendations offered within to eliminate Indigenous-specific racism and make healthcare safer and more effective may be broadly applied across Canada. It is imperative that we take concrete steps to try and break the cycle across research, clinical care, and education.
Thank you, Stefan. Continuing on with the themes of imperfect allies, I will be discussing the next theme related to recognizing the power of words. So when we talk about disparities in health outcomes in Indigenous communities, I think it's important to start with an example in my field of heart failure. The Mau Ahiomoan Epidemiology Partnership is a report that was published in 2020, which evaluates the mortality related to chronic conditions in 59 First Nation communities in Northern Ontario. In this report, there are clear differences in the prevalence of cardiovascular disease in Indigenous communities compared to the rest of Ontarians. With regards to heart failure deaths, which is shown for women on your left and men on your right, the purple bars represent Indigenous communities, whereas the yellow bars represent non-Indigenous Ontarians. You can appreciate that both male and female Indigenous community members have a higher incidence of heart failure mortality in all age brackets. There's a clear disparity, but what's not said in this graph is why there's a higher rate of heart failure. What are the data not telling us? Using the lens of Western medicine, we can identify increased risk factors of heart failure, but this model of care focuses on the manifest reasons that are contributing to disease. It's important to highlight that this type of thinking contributes to a deficit-based discourse, where the mode of thinking is framed in a negative narrative of deficiency and disempowerment. For example, if I say that this patient has heart failure as a result of diabetes, high blood pressure, and sedentary behavior, I'm in essence blaming the patient and losing sight of the historical and social context. Whereas if we think of the social determinants of health using the tree analogy, we can identify more distal causes of health disparities and recognize the impact of colonial history, abuse, and intergenerational trauma resulting in the increased incidence of these diseases. This is where we're forced to challenge our traditional care models, where we focus on treating the disease, to a more holistic model where we focus on the person. So back to the analogy, we're not just looking at the leaves, but we're looking at the trunk, the roots, and the entire tree. To be able to address the distal causes of disparities, we need to first recognize our own biases. In order to do so, we enrolled in the Yas program, which is an online cultural safety training course. One of the key features of this course is to recognize our implicit biases, stereotypes, and prejudices, along with our positionality as researchers. One of the most influential exercises that we did was to complete sentences on indigeneity. For example, we were asked to think about how Indigenous people were described. I'm just going to pause for a moment for you to think of words you've heard describing Indigenous people in the healthcare setting or in the emergency room. Through this exercise, we became more aware of the power of words. It's not uncommon to hear such judgment in the healthcare setting, where Indigenous peoples are described as less worthy of care, drug-seeking, less capable, recipients of free stuff, alcoholics, and frequent flyers, which is a derogatory statement often used in the emergency room to describe a patient who is taking advantage of the system. It's these words that allow us to dehumanize the patient and place the blame and the responsibility of the disease on the patient without recognizing the broader circumstances that may be contributing. When we embarked on our journey for this capstone, we wanted to improve cardiovascular outcomes using technology, because technology has been cited as the great equalizer that will close the disparity gap. Just from this slide, you can see that we have a wide array of tools that can potentially improve cardiac care. But reflecting on the core principles of our learning and our positionality, These devices alone will not narrow the disparity gap, and they may actually cause harm. Let's go back to the power of words. And this is an example that Dr. Ross's patient brought to her attention. A cornerstone of heart failure care is to limit salt and fluid intake. From a technology standpoint, a diet application could address this need. But in the Indigenous community, these recommendations can be emotionally triggering and bring traumatic memories from the residential school periods. So in fact, technology cannot bypass longstanding historical issues such as Canada's colonial history. What this means is that we cannot assume that by dropping these specific technologies that we can promote health, improve access to health, or that the communities will even adopt their use. Instead, we need to collaborate with each community to assess their needs and the wider implication of these tools. In order to guide the research and to ensure that the community's values are upheld, we need to apply OCAP principles. These principles establish how First Nations data, information, and cultural knowledge should be collected, accessed, used, and shared. OCAP stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. It forces us to think of these questions where we ask about the purpose of research, the type of information that will be required, how the community will benefit, and the potential harms. These tenets have helped us develop a framework where we shifted from our original question of how we can improve the cardiac health of Indigenous patients to what are the characteristics of digital health that are meaningful and relevant to the Indigenous person.
Thanks, Yas. For this third lesson, I'll describe our reflective approach to embracing the 4 R's of Indigenous research. Dare I say, one of the good things COVID has provided our group is the time for active reflection. For our group and many others, the 4 R's of Indigenous research is a useful tool for self-reflection to help lay the foundation for meaningful research projects and building relationships in a good way. During COVID, we were able to pause and look at our progress to date and what we hoped for moving forward and ask ourselves important questions surrounding the 4 R's. Were we respecting the knowledge and expertise of Indigenous communities in our process so far? Was this research even deemed relevant and important to the community? Are we fostering reciprocal relationships, or was this a one-sided push? And were we taking responsibility to actively develop authentic relationships with communities? In starting our reflective process, we had to look critically at where we were on this continuum of research. We initially searched for data that could show we'd found a need. We drafted an initial study protocol on a remote patient monitoring program equipped with semi-structured interviews and further design adaptations. This approach was aligned with a traditional research approach and framed through a Western worldview. If you remember our discussion on the ethical space earlier, this wasn't the right way to do research, and we were going down the same path as many previous non-Indigenous researchers, pushing an agenda that would serve to benefit us more than the communities. So we started to look for how we could move along this continuum of community engagement, shifting from a traditional research approach to a community-based participatory research approach, which values equitable partnerships to promote real, positive change. We needed to build relationships with communities and shift the power away from ourselves as researchers back to the communities as equal research partners. We've started the process of community-based research, and we still continue to engage in the relationship building efforts moving forward. And so before any research activities can even begin in community-based research, we need to build and sustain meaningful relationships, as I just mentioned on the previous slide. This started pre-COVID when team members from the Peter Munk Cardiac Center visited the Winnebago Area Health Authority, which we'll now refer to as WAHA, to learn from the community and begin to establish a relationship. WAHA provides healthcare services to approximately 15,000 predominantly Cree people in 6 communities along the western coast of James Bay and Hudson Bay. Travel out of the community for specialized care, such as cardiac care, can take anywhere from 1 to 9 hours by varying modes of transportation. Many of these communities do not have year-round road access, as they're only built in the winter as ice roads. The initial intent of the visit was to explore whether digital health interventions, such as a remote patient monitoring program, could increase access to cardiac care. And again, if we reflect on this trip and the 4 hours of research, this was an important and necessary step in establishing meaningful relationships, but we still have to question how the implementation of digital health interventions, such as the one we had in mind, would adhere to the 4 hours of research. In further establishing our relationship last year, we collaborated with WAHA on a large tri-council grant called Empower HF. The goal of this grant was to enable access to high quality heart failure care supported by the use of digital health interventions. To facilitate bi-directional knowledge sharing about digital health, Indigenous perspectives, and issues around access to care, our team hosted a full-day workshop with over 70 participants from across Canada, including leadership from WAHA. As part of this workshop, we used a graphic facilitator to capture real-time translations of conversations in a visual format, similar to what we're doing today with Laura. This facilitation is a strengths-based and participatory method and is a common form of knowledge translation when working with Indigenous communities. Some of the learnings specific to WAHA and doing research in a good way have been captured and include the following. A strength-based approach means that researchers place Indigenous voices at the center of the research process. Building relationships with Indigenous communities is at the core of successful research and healthcare delivery. Establishing a trusted relationship with communities requires significant time, investment, and commitment. Researchers wishing to engage with Indigenous communities should participate in land-based programming to better understand Indigenous ways of knowing. This includes learning from elders and knowledge keepers. Our relationship building efforts and personal learnings began the shift in our research approach with WAHA, which has resulted in significant iterative changes to our proposed methodologies. Another major relationship building effort our group has been involved with began in January 2019, when a staff representative from the Peter Monk Cardiac Center, Stefan from our group, attended the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation Health Summit to learn more about their health transformation agenda and explore opportunities for partnership. NAN is a political treaty organization representing 49 First Nation communities in Northern Ontario, with a total population of approximately 45,000 people. This begun a relationship building journey with NAN that has reached several milestones together, including a signed relationship accord between UHN and NAN on March 23rd of this year. This partnership recognizes that innovative approaches and technological advances are essential to improving the healthcare system for NAN territory, accompanied by measurements in quality improvement and data collection. So one potential vision to improve equitable access to care in NAN territory is a concept of healthcare without borders. This would include community members and their support systems at the center, with direct access to virtual specialist care or other interprofessional care providers that are trained in cultural safety as called for in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to actions. It would ensure that all digital health interventions are validated, accessible to all, and adhere to the data governance principles of OCAP. And perhaps most importantly, ensures that the right to self-determination for Indigenous communities is respected when considering any new model of care. While this is all conceptual for now, we recognize that to move forward, we must continue to actively reflect, be iterative with our approach, and continue to ask ourselves the same questions with regards to the 4 hours of research.
Thanks, Kailey. I'm now going to discuss our final theme, and one that is pervasive in clinical care, not remaining silent or neutral in the face of injustice. Being an ally is more than just being quietly disgusted by the loss of innocent children's lives, or to like a post where someone denounces the mistreatment of Indigenous people in a healthcare setting. It's not wrong to have these feelings, but it's our responsibility to go beyond frustration and anger, to build moral courage, to call out these practices, policies, and procedures, and to advocate for systemic change. In the clinical world, we often go the extra mile for a patient we can identify with. Unfortunately, most clinicians do not identify with Indigenous patients or do not feel the need to go the extra mile. It's not always about standing up for the headline-worthy mistreatment, but about calling out what I like to call these repeated acts of omission, where remaining neutral is to be complicit in widening the disparities. We need to advocate for a speak up culture and use our scope of influence to impact real change.
For these last few minutes, we've described to you all our journey as imperfect allies. We say imperfect to you as we admit there were many mistakes we've made and learned from throughout the past year and more. We recognize our collective transformative journey of research and rediscovery and acknowledge that it's hard to challenge the status quo of research. There will always be researchers that will disagree with an approach that doesn't conform to the traditional Western biomedical approach. We understand that to authentically engage in the research, we had to learn the history and address the biases we hold. We had to change our approach as researchers who are used to dictating the research agenda to embrace the right of Indigenous communities to self-determine the relevant and meaningful research. And finally, to truly embrace translational research, we realize that we have to take the time to build and sustain trusting and meaningful relationships to create change that is positive and beneficial as deemed by the communities themselves. In closing thoughts, we'd like to thank all of the following for their contributions to our learnings over the past several years. This includes course instructors at the University of Toronto, leadership from the Winnebago Area Health Authority, as well as health system and political leadership. There were also many others that have influenced us that are not represented on this slide. We're all on a new journey of research and would not be able to do so without the guidance of each of these individuals. We very much look forward to working with them more in the future. Thank you.
Excellently well, excellently done. Thank you very much.